Brianna Heath. I am the author of Robbie, McNeil Set List, which is a queer mystery with a neurodivergent main character. I am also a neurodivergent woman, and I've worked in the field of neurodevelopmental research for 10 years, and I teach seminars to physicians, psychologists, and other clinicians about accessibility and inclusivity. So today I'm going to combine my two interests and talk about writing neurodivergent characters. I am going to keep this fairly big picture, but I'll be going through aspects of your characters to consider and think through as you develop them, whether that's something you do before you start drafting or your process, that's something you figure out as you write them. A couple of things that I like to preface with. For the most part, I will be speaking broadly about multiple conditions that kind of fall under the neurodiversity umbrella, but I may touch on individual topics like autism as well as broader topics like disability. As much as possible, I try to avoid pathologizing and medicalized language, but my apologies in advance if there's any that I've overlooked. I also primarily use identity first language, like saying an autistic person rather than a person with autism, although I may use both types of language interchangeably depending on context and grammar. I know those of you viewing may have your own personal preferences, so I just want to acknowledge that how I speak may not align with everyone's individual preference. All right, on to the main topic. To talk about neurodivergent characters, I want to start by defining neurodiversity in the way that I'll be discussing it, so we're all on the same page. I like to start with this image. We can tell these are all flowers. There are a variety of colors, lots of yellows and orange, but some blues and purples in there too. None of these are better or worse at being a flower. But not every flower thrives in every condition. An orchid needs careful care and nutrients, while a dandelion might pop up from any crack in the sidewalk. A flower that grows well in the rainforest won't do well in the desert. And this is the core premise of neurodiversity as a concept. Human brains function in the same way as many other things in biology, with a huge variety of ways they work and a variety of needs in order to thrive. And like in the picture where there's common colors like yellow and then some colors like blue and purple are more rare, this is essentially the concept of neurotypical versus neurodivergent. With that diversity in how brains work, some ways are more common and the types of supports they need, because everyone needs supports in life, are fairly common and they're often easy to get. So neurotypical. And then in the other direction, there are brains that work in less common ways and often need less common or more intensive supports. So neurodivergent. And there are so many ways to be neurodivergent. The term originated in the autistic community, but it has spread to encompass ADHD, learning disabilities like dyslexia or dysgraphia, intellectual disabilities, mental health conditions, and more. And neurodivergent people often may have similar or shared experiences, but it really can be a wide range of how neurodivergence presents and what that looks like in day-to-day life for each person. And there's often a lot of overlap. So this is a figure of traits, for example, that are present in autism and ADHD. And you can see that there are some aspects that are unique to each, and there are definitely some that are shared between both. And about 30 to 50% of autistic people have ADHD traits, and about 60 to 70% of people with ADHD have autism traits. So there is kind of that overlap. But there are also a lot of differences. And so in thinking about writing neurodivergent characters, that variety is the critical baseline that we need to remember. A character is not a dumping ground for every possible trait associated with one type of neurodivergence or another. Using autism as an example, this is a graphic I like. It kind of shows the spectrum is not a straight line from all the traits to none of the traits, but individualized compositions of characteristics, each with their own scale of how much they impact someone's life. And these things are also not static, right? So they may change over time or in different circumstances. And remember that there are a variety of external and internal experiences. If you aren't writing from your own personal experience, it's often easier for people to include visually apparent traits that you've seen in others, like stimming or tics. But just be cognizant of how those are very much the tip of the iceberg. So avoid fixating on these external aspects to the exclusion of internal. And remember that external actions may have different underlying causes. For example, an autistic person may stim when they're excited, but they also may do that as a self-soothing activity when they're anxious. And obviously those are very different internal experiences. Even though to an outsider, the physical action may look similar. Being neurodivergent does color every aspect of daily life, but it's also not an entire person. So creating a fully fleshed out realistic character means neurodivergence, broadly, cannot be the only character trait you give them. Start by breaking things down a little further for yourself. Depending on your setting and the story's context, characters may have a specific diagnosis using modern language, or they may not. In my book, although it takes place in our regular contemporary world, my main character, Robbie, comes from a background where she would not have had access to formal diagnostic services or even known how to informally learn enough to self-diagnose. Absent a label, though, her brain still works in a very particular way. So the first step in developing a character is figuring out what that looks like. So I'm going to give a couple pathways here to writing. I have a firm magpie philosophy when it comes to writing advice. Take the bits that are shiny back to your own writing nest and put them together with whatever other methods you like. If something I describe here makes sense for you, sparks something, great. If something I describe doesn't align with your writing process, feel free to leave it. For my intensive planners and plotters, character sheets are absolutely something that can help with thinking through how a character's mind works and how that will affect them along the course of the story. You can list out traits, like on the graphic I showed earlier, and go through and determine which are stronger or more impactful and which aren't, keeping in mind that just because something is less impactful doesn't necessarily mean it's absent altogether. It may be something that only impacts them in specific situations or contexts, or some things may only affect them in the absence of their supports and accommodations. And there are, of course, a million ways you can sketch this out for yourself, but just to give you an example of a way to do it, here's a little table that you can make for a character and build out. And I'll note here that this doesn't just have to apply to neurodivergent traits. You can use it more broadly, but obviously that's not our focus today. Start by listing out different traits. For each, think through what that looks like for the character in their daily life, both in terms of strengths or advantages and challenges. And then think through what supports and accommodations the character has or the people around them may provide, and either common or uncommon barriers they may run into in having access to those supports. Consider how they would react or how that may impact them if they were in that kind of situation without access. Neurodivergence goes beyond fun, quirky traits, and it has very real and significant impacts on daily life, especially when someone has fewer supports. ADHD is sometimes portrayed as a fun little quirk that results in getting distracted by cute animals or shiny objects or being a little spontaneous. But it also can mean missing critical deadlines to the point of getting fired from your job, forgetting to pay bills and having a service shut off, or having debt start to build up, or disordered sleep patterns that exacerbate brain fog and make all of this worse. And from a more formal perspective, this is basically what tips something from a scattered collection of very human traits to something that is actually autism or ADHD or another form of neurodivergence. Is it something that significantly impacts someone's ability to perform their activities of daily life? As you're thinking about this, Also think through other life factors as well, like how wealthy a person is, or whether they live somewhere that would give them access to different resources or supports. That said, some people do have supports built into their life. Someone who can't consistently keep track of bills may have a partner who handles household finances. I have a character who's dyslexic, but she extensively uses speech to text, and she has a partner who can help her in many situations if something like speech to text isn't an option. So in many parts of her life, her reading difficulties don't impact her as much, while there are still some times where she has none of those supports, and it is a source of difficulty and a source of frustration. And even with supports or some level, that comes with a level of anxiety. What if I run into an unexpected situation and can't handle it? What if I mess up an opportunity that I won't get again? Because I promise you, neurodivergent people have a lifetime of experiences being misunderstood and dismissed. Often there are things that neurotypical people take for granted that we have to work so hard for, and we've all had the experience of missing the mark or not meeting neurotypical expectations. Some aspects of this go hand in hand with your world building. So think about how your world works with your character and vice versa. If your character is sensitive to loud noises or is easily overwhelmed in noisy environments, how does your setting play into that? Has your character lived in a small, quiet place their whole life? And they might not know the extent of how much a noisy environment might affect them. Or maybe they used to live somewhere noisy and they've needed to find a home or move somewhere where they can have more predictable quiet time. The next aspect to think about is camouflage or masking. These are terms to describe the ways that neurodivergent people have learned to act in order to present in a specific way in certain contexts or situations. Generally, how to act more like a neurotypical person. And the idea of masking is not something unique to neurodivergent people. Everyone masks or shifts their behavior in some way based on context. So think about how you behave at work in a meeting with your boss versus how you behave hanging out at home with your best friend, or even how you behave by yourself. The difference is that neurodivergent people do this behavioral masking far more often, for more sustained periods, and as a result, it takes more of a mental and emotional toll, and it can even result in its own form of burnout. So the last column I have here is for thinking through what types of behaviors a character uses to mask a given trait in situations where it's a disadvantage. How easy is it for them to do so? How much of their mental energy and attention is being taken up by focusing on keeping up that mask? And what might happen if they either aren't masking as well as they'd like, or they've put so much focus on masking one trait that they haven't done so for another, or they've just hit a point where they don't have the energy and mental capacity to continue to keep up this mask. Now, I know some people are probably looking at my little table and going, nope, that's not for me. If you're more of a pantser and detailed character breakdowns aren't your thing, or you outline things like plot but prefer to learn about your characters as you write, this is something you can always come back to in revision or figure out as you go along. Consider the situations you've put your character in, the supports and stressors they have in that moment, and then when you revise, adjust their behaviors and thoughts to be more in line with the broader pattern that you've created for them. If it works for your writing process, you can even write some mini scenes or vignettes, putting your character in different situations, seeing what happens, and then applying that knowledge of how they act or how they react consistently as you write the larger story. And regardless of your place along the plotter-pantser continuum, the next thing I want to talk about applies to everyone. Interiority. Some people love it. I don't know who you are, but you exist. Some of us struggle with it immensely. If this isn't a term that you've come across before, interiority refers to a character's inner thoughts and feelings. It's how you get your reader inside a character's head and really seeing what's motivating them, what's impacting them. Interiority is a huge strength of written word as a medium for storytelling. Unless you've got voiceover narration, it really isn't something we get to see in visual media like TV shows or movies. And even with voiceover narration, it's still not quite the same as truly being immersed in a character's innermost thoughts. So if you are writing neurodivergent characters, especially if you are writing from your own lived experience, you will absolutely have readers who see themselves in the character and find them totally relatable, and you will have neurotypical readers who are baffled by the decisions and actions your character makes. Some people will get the dreaded, "can't relate to this character" feedback. So I talked earlier about how there can be overlap between diagnoses or presentations of neurodivergent traits. Some traits may have similar big picture descriptors, but manifest in slightly different ways. Difficulties holding a conversation could be because someone isn't sure how to come up with an appropriate response, or they aren't sure how to figure out whether it's their turn to speak. Or it could be that their mind wanders, so they miss what someone's saying and can't keep up with a conversation, or maybe they're impulsive and they interrupt frequently. To an outsider, many of these look like this person is rude, or this person just isn't very personable. But your reader shouldn't be an outsider. They should be in the character's head, seeing those mechanisms behind the scenes. What's going on that other characters aren't seeing? What's under the surface that the reader might not know otherwise? And how much effort is your character putting into trying to mask these traits so that those around them don't know what your reader now knows? This is where interiority is really critical. You don't need to change your character. You don't need to tone down their neurodivergent traits. But you may need to sort of hold your reader's hand a bit more than you would with a neurotypical character, and act as a sort of translator, showing them the character's internal thoughts and feelings. And if there's a mismatch between thoughts and actions, make sure your reader can see that clearly. And again, that's not exclusive to neurodivergent characters. All sorts of characters may feel one way and act another. But for a well-rounded neurodivergent character that a reader can follow along with, that discrepancy needs to be laid out clearly and explained. If you're a neurodivergent and you're writing from your own experience, I actually recommend finding a neurotypical beta reader who can go through your manuscript and tell you when something doesn't make sense, when they don't understand the character's logic, or why the character feeling one way would result in a particular action. Then you can go through, and you don't have to, like I said, change the traits, but you can look at those spots and see, how can I better explain what's going on in my character's head so that someone who doesn't have this personal experience can find it understandable, if not relatable. The last thing I'm going to say to wrap this up is a phrase that is very commonly used among neurodiversity advocates, disability advocates, and that is nothing about us without us. If you are writing a character whose neurodivergence doesn't come entirely from your own lived experience of being someone with that identity, make sure that you are talking to people who do have that experience. There is no perfect way to write a neurodivergent character. You can't possibly capture every person's experience. But you can and should put in every effort to present a realistic experience. So have sensitivity readers and beta readers who share your character's identity, and make sure that you're portraying them in a way that feels accurate and is not harmful. And keep in mind that experiences can vary significantly based on other aspects of identity. A Black woman is going to have a different experience being autistic as she moves through the world compared to an autistic white man. So ensure that if you're representing a particular combination of intersecting identities, that you aren't solely relying on getting feedback from people who only have one part of that combination. And as I said at the beginning, my goal for this talk was to keep it fairly broad, to be applicable for many writers and many types of characters across genres, across settings. But for everything I've talked about today, consider it a starting point. Dive deep, get to know your characters, understand what makes their brain work the way it does, and even if you don't end up putting every one of these details on the page, having considered the character from multiple angles will give you more realistic and engaging writing. So good luck, and I hope to see the body of works out there highlighting neurodivergent characters continue to expand.